Subscribe now, it's completely free and it won't cost you a thing. Section 1, The Breaking Point. The Galactic Council Hall was silent. A silence thick with fear, uncertainty, and the unmistakable weight of a looming disaster. Dozens of species sat in their seats, their expressions ranging from nervous to outright terrified. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Kalen of the Soul Dominion, his presence radiating cold fury. "We have tried," he said, voice devoid of warmth. "For 50 years we have tried." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. Before him, a council of alien leaders, beings that once dictated the fate of entire worlds, now shifted uncomfortably, their ceremonial robes and regalia feeling more like chains than symbols of power. They had pushed the Deathworlders too far. And now there was no escape. The speaker for the Viarian Consortium, a thin-framed avian with jeweled feathers, leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ambassador Kalen, surely we can come to an understanding. The Dominion's actions are..." No. That single word hit like an asteroid impact. The Viarian delegate flinched. Others froze, their eyes darting to one another. For years, they had relied on humanity's patience, its endless willingness to negotiate, to compromise. That patience had just run out. Kalen took a slow step forward, the heavy boots of his combat armor clicking against the polished floor. "You call them actions," he continued, voice sharpening. "We call them massacres." A screen behind him lit up, flashing through images that needed no explanation. Human colonies burned to the ground, ships shattered in orbit, entire families executed by those who had sworn neutrality. The Tarkin warbands, the ex-Israeli Dominion, the Al-Jathai clans, they had all taken part in raiding and pillaging Deathworlder settlements, believing that the humans would always come back to the table. That illusion was gone. The Speaker of the Council, a towering reptilian from the Anzari Union, attempted to regain control. "Ambassador, these actions were not sanctioned by the Galactic Council. You know this." Kalen's cold glare locked onto him. "And yet you did nothing." A murmur rippled through the room. That was the truth they had all tried to avoid saying aloud. The Galactic Council had allowed these attacks to happen. Treaties had been signed, alliances declared, but when Deathworlders bled, no one came. Kalen's voice lowered. "No treaties. No warnings. No negotiations." The room collectively tensed. "This is not a declaration of war," he continued, his gloved hands tightening at his sides. "This is a response." Silence. And then the chamber shook. A distant rumble, deep and terrible, vibrated through the walls. Lights flickered. A second later, the holographic displays behind Kalen changed. Live feeds replacing the damning evidence of past atrocities. The Soul Dominion fleet had arrived. Hundreds of warships broke into real space above the Council station, their gunmetal hulls reflecting the cold void of space. The flagship, the UNS Wrath of Terra, dominated the feed, its cannons primed and shields humming. One by one, the other Deathworlder fleets emerged. Marzian warlords, the Titan Enclave, the Outer Colonies Defense Corps ***. They had not come to talk. They had come to end things. The realization struck the Council like a thunderclap. This wasn't an invasion. It was an execution. Kalen turned his back on them, tapping a command on his wrist console. The feed shifted, now showing the internal corridors of the Council's own station. Hundreds of Deathworlder strike teams were already inside. He spoke one final time, his voice softer now, but infinitely more terrifying. "The talking is over." Then the lights went out. Panic erupted in the chamber. Council members scrambled from their seats, shouting conflicting orders. Some bolted for exits, only to find reinforced blast doors sealing them inside. Others activated their comms, desperate for their personal guards to intervene, only to hear static. The Deathworlders had jammed every signal. A red emergency light flickered to life above the main exit. A single pulse. Then another. Boom. The doors exploded inward. A team of armored Deathworlder operatives stormed in, their visors glowing in the dim emergency lighting. They moved with precision, rifles raised, scanning the chamber like predators sighting prey. A Sendarian diplomat shrieked, raising his arms in surrender. We surrender. Please." One of the Deathworlders glanced at him but said nothing. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to ensure compliance. Kalen remained still, watching as the chaos unfolded. This wasn't a slaughter. Not yet. Humanity had never been needlessly cruel. But they had given every opportunity for the Galactic Council to correct their mistakes. They hadn't. A Dominion soldier lunged from the side, a plasma dagger in hand, attempting to take one of the operatives by surprise. The Deathworlder caught his wrist mid-strike and crushed it. A sickening snap echoed in the chamber. The soldier collapsed with a scream, the weapon clattering to the floor. The Deathworlder didn't even finish him off. He simply kicked the blade away and moved on. A warning. Another screen flickered, displaying a countdown. 10 minutes. One of the alien diplomats found his voice, his feathers ruffled in sheer panic. What happens in 10 minutes? Kalen turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. Your last chance. Another pulse. 9 minutes. The Galactic Council had spent years believing that Deathworlders were a problem to be controlled, a force to be placated through words and treaties. Now they had 10 minutes to understand the truth. There were no more second chances. No treaties. No warnings. Only war. The countdown continued. 8 minutes. The Galactic Council chamber was a battlefield of desperation. The once mighty rulers of the stars now found themselves at the mercy of those they had underestimated. Some pleaded, their voices cracking with fear, while others sat frozen, unable to process the inevitability of what was coming. Ambassador Kalen remained impassive, standing tall in the dim emergency lighting, his combat armor illuminated by the red flashes from the countdown display. His operatives remained in formation, their weapons unwavering, their presence a silent promise of what would come if compliance was not given. 7 minutes. The Speaker of the Council, the towering reptilian from the Anzari Union, finally gathered himself enough to step forward. His scales, once pristine, were dulled with sweat. Ambassador Kalen, please. There must be another way. This level of force is unnecessary. Kalen tilted his head slightly. Was it unnecessary when our colonies were burned? When our ships were left drifting, families still inside? When your fleets turned away as Deathworlders screamed for aid? His voice was quiet, but every word landed like a hammer. No. It was necessary. The speaker's jaw clenched. You let it happen, Kalen continued, stepping forward. You sat on your golden thrones, making speeches about peace while our people were exterminated. Now you expect mercy? The words sent a ripple of shame through the chamber. None of them had an answer. Because there wasn't one. 6 minutes. The Vierian Consortium delegate trembled, his jeweled feathers shaking. You can't punish all of us for the actions of the few. Some of us stood against the raids. And yet you did nothing. Kalen's tone turned razor sharp. The moment your economies, your trade routes, your comfortable little alliances were at risk, you looked away. You sent condemnations and empty words while we buried our dead. The room fell into silence again. No one could refute it. 5 minutes. Kalen tapped his wrist console and the screen shifted again. Now they displayed the outer defense stations of the Galactic Council, their once powerful fleets standing idly as Deathworlder warships moved into position. We gave you warnings, Kalen continued. This is not the beginning of a war. This is the end of one you started decades ago. The countdown was at 4 minutes when the first explosions erupted outside. The outer defense stations were gone. The feed showed fire and debris scattering into space, the remnants of the Council's last true stronghold. Not a single Deathworlder vessel had been touched. Panic surged through the chamber. You're committing genocide? A Radari delegate shrieked. This is madness. Kalen's cold gaze locked onto the Radari. Genocide? No. We don't wipe out entire species. We don't glass planets indiscriminately. We eliminate threats. We finish wars the way Deathworlders always have, decisively. 3 minutes. An old diplomat from the Zelthari Imperium, her silvered fur matted with stress, spoke in a broken whisper. What happens if we refuse? Kalen didn't blink. Then you die. A slow, creeping horror spread across their faces. They knew he wasn't bluffing. 2 minutes. The speaker's voice boomed over the chaos. Enough. His reptilian eyes darted toward the countdown, his hands clenching. Then finally he bowed his head. We surrender. The chamber went deathly silent. Kalen's expression did not change. He simply nodded once. Then you live. 1 minute. The screens flickered again, the Deathworlder fleet standing down, weapons disengaging. The execution had been called off. For now. Kalen turned to his operatives. Secure the station. All council members are now under Dominion custody. Treat them well as they treated us. The war was over. But the era of Deathworlders had just begun. The aftermath. The Galactic Council was no more. In a matter of hours, its control had collapsed. The largest and most influential governing body in known history had ceased to exist, not with a war but with a reckoning. The Deathworlders did not raise cities. They did not exterminate civilians. They did not enslave worlds. They occupied. Ships descended into once untouchable capital planets, not as conquerors but as enforcers. Governments that had ignored Deathworlder suffering were dismantled. Leaders who had sat idle while colonies burned were removed. Those who had orchestrated atrocities? Executed. On the Galactic Council's former homeworld, the streets were lined with Deathworlder troops. Their presence was not chaotic, it was deliberate. There was no looting, no unnecessary destruction. Order replaced corruption. Kalen stood on the balcony of what had once been the High Council's central command, watching as Dominion officers moved methodically below. Admiral Vasquez approached, her expression unreadable. It's done. Resistance has collapsed across all major systems. Some pockets are still holding out, but they won't last. Kalen exhaled. Good. And the civilian response? She hesitated. It's mixed. Some are terrified. Others, well, some are welcoming the change. The council was rotting from the inside. They just never thought they'd be on the receiving end of its collapse. He nodded, unsurprised. They will adapt. Vasquez studied him carefully. And what about us? We weren't built to rule an empire. Kalen's gaze didn't waver. We aren't here to rule. We're here to make sure this never happens again. She didn't argue. The stars had been reshaped, not through conquest but through consequence. The era of false peace was over. Now the galaxy would learn what it meant to truly fear Deathworlders. The old galaxy was dead. The Galactic Council, the bloated bureaucracy that had ruled for centuries, lay in ruin. Its leaders, once untouchable, were now prisoners, their fates uncertain. The Deathworlders had not simply broken their chains, they had shattered them. Across the core systems, the transition of power was swift and merciless. There was no drawn-out war, no endless negotiations. The Dominion moved with cold efficiency, removing those who had ruled through corruption and cowardice. Some council-aligned planetary governments surrendered immediately, terrified of the alternative. Others foolishly resisted. They did not last long. The burning of Cravathus. The planet Cravathus, an industrial stronghold that had supplied fleets to the Council's war efforts, declared independence the moment the Council fell. Its ruling class, the Exaraton dynasty, sent a message of defiance to the Dominion. We are no slaves to Deathworlders. We will fight to the last. They had expected hesitation. They had expected a drawn-out siege, demands for negotiation. What they got was obliteration. The UNS Wrath of Terra led the assault. There were no warnings, no grand speeches. The Deathworlders had given enough warnings already. Orbital bombardments shattered the planetary shields in a matter of hours. Precision strikes crippled their war factories before a single fighter could launch. When ground forces landed, they met only scattered resistance. Most had already surrendered or fled. The Exaraton rulers who had sworn to fight to the last, were captured hiding in underground bunkers, trembling as Dominion soldiers ripped open the blast doors. There was no mercy. What remained of the planet's governing body was dragged before a Dominion tribunal. The trials were swift. The sentences even swifter. Executions were broadcast to every remaining planetary governor across former Council space. This was the price of defiance. The message was clear. There would be no more leniency. Reconstruction or domination. With the old order wiped away, the real challenge began. What came next? Elias Carter stood at the edge of a command platform overlooking the former Council capital, now renamed Terra's Reach under Dominion rule. The skyline was still smoldering, though the fires had long since died down. Beneath him, thousands of Dominion personnel worked tirelessly to stabilize the planet. Admiral Vasquez stood beside him, arms crossed. The last of the Council sympathizers are being rounded up. Some have already asked for terms? She scoffed. Funny how quickly their ideals crumble when they're the ones under siege. Carter said nothing, his gaze fixed on the city below. For the first time they were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to build. This isn't over, he murmured. The remnants of the old order will scatter to the fringes. They'll bide their time, waiting for a moment to strike back. Vasquez nodded. They'll learn soon enough. This isn't a temporary occupation. This is the new reality. The weight of that truth pressed upon them. The Deathworlders had spent too long being prey. It was time for the galaxy to understand the consequences of their patience running out. The purge of the outer systems. While the Dominion established control over the core worlds, insurgencies were already forming in the Outer Rim territories. Many of these planets had profited from Council rule, growing fat while the Deathworlders suffered. They assumed the Dominion would be slow to react. They were wrong. The purge began on Calvaris 3, a once prosperous hub of trade that had funneled weapons and ships to anti-Dominion forces. They had ignored every warning, every plea for neutrality. When Dominion forces arrived, they did not land negotiators. They landed fire. Fleet Commander Lucien Varro, a veteran of the war, delivered the final transmission before the assault began. For too long you have sold the weapons that killed our people. You have built your fortunes on the suffering of Deathworlders. That time is over. Surrender or be erased. They chose resistance. The Dominion's shock troops, enhanced soldiers from Mars and Titan, stormed the planet within hours. Entire city blocks were leveled as Dominion mechs marched through the streets. Within 3 days, Calvaris 3 no longer existed as an independent entity. Its wealth was seized, its leadership executed, and its infrastructure repurposed for the new order. Calvaris 3 was only the beginning. The Hawker Syndicate, longtime profiteers of black market deals with warlords, attempted to flee into deep space. Dominion interceptors hunted them down one by one. Their hidden bases, thought to be untraceable, were turned into smoldering wrecks. By the end of the month, the message was clear across every sector. The Dominion was not interested in half measures. The galaxy forever changed. As the Dominion solidified its rule, something remarkable happened: stability. Planets that had been choked by bureaucracy for centuries suddenly found their government streamlined. Corrupt officials were removed. Crime syndicates that had flourished under the Council's watchful neglect were eradicated overnight. The Deathworlders, once feared as harbingers of chaos, were proving more efficient rulers than the Council had ever been. Not all planets resisted. Many embraced the new order. A council of human and allied Deathworlder leaders was established on Terra's Reach, ensuring that planetary governors adhered to the new Dominion Code, a set of strict but fair laws designed to prevent the rot of the old council from taking root again. There were no illusions. The Dominion was not a democracy. It was not an empire. It was a consequence. A consequence of a galaxy that had ignored its own sins for too long. The warning. As the weeks turned to months, rumors spread of a surviving faction of Council loyalists, regrouping in the deep void, gathering strength. Carter was not concerned. Standing once more at the balcony of the Dominion's new capital, he watched as the first waves of new warships rolled off production lines, each one more advanced, more lethal than anything before. He turned to Admiral Vasquez. "Send a message to the remnants. One final warning." She smirked, already knowing what he was going to say. The message was simple. "You saw what happened when our patience ran out. Test us again, and you will see what happens when we have none left." The galaxy had changed. What once was a chaotic, bureaucratic mess of weak-willed rulers had now become a disciplined, efficient Dominion. The Deathworlders had imposed order where the Galactic Council had only fostered corruption. Planets that had once trembled at the thought of war now understood peace through consequence. Yet there were still those who refused to learn. The Remnant Uprising. Not all had surrendered to the Dominion's rule. In the Veil Nebula, a sector on the edge of known space, the last remnants of the Council's loyalists had gathered. They called themselves the True Federation, though to the Dominion, they were nothing more than delusional fugitives clinging to a broken past. Fleet Admiral Orestes, a former high-ranking officer of the Council's navy, had assembled what remained of their forces. They had cobbled together a fleet from old Council warships, mercenary bands and defectors who still believed that the Dominion could be undone. "We will strike at their core," Orestes announced to his commanders. "We will remind the galaxy that the Dominion is not invincible." The plan was reckless, a desperate raid on Terra's Reach, the very heart of Deathworlder rule. Orestes had convinced himself that if they could cripple Dominion leadership, the Empire would collapse. He was a fool. The ambush at Varghese Prime. The Dominion had long known of the so-called True Federation. They had allowed them to gather, allowed them to believe they were safe, allowed them to think they had a chance. Then they struck. As Orestes' fleet moved toward Terra's Reach, they were intercepted at Varghese Prime. The Dominion's trap had been set months in advance. Stealth frigates had been tracking them, feeding false intelligence, luring them into the perfect kill zone. The battle was over before it began. The Dominion fleet emerged from the darkness, their ships cutting through enemy formations with surgical precision. Orestes' forces, outmatched and outmaneuvered, were torn apart within minutes. Half the fleet was destroyed in the first volley. Panic set in. Ships tried to retreat, only to find their escape routes already sealed by Dominion interdictors. There would be no running. Admiral Vasquez gave only one order: no prisoners, By the end of the engagement, not a single true Federation ship remained. The last resistance of the old galaxy had been erased from history. The fate of the survivors. While most of the fleet was obliterated in space, a few remnants had escaped to the surface of Varghese Prime. These were the last remnants of the Federation's leadership, desperate and hunted. The Dominion's shock troopers were deployed in full force, elite squads armed with state-of-the-art weapons and exo-armor. They swept through the forests and mountains where the fugitives had fled, tracking them like prey. For 3 days the remnants fought. They deployed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, anything to slow their inevitable fate. But the Dominion had planned for this. Drones patrolled the skies, cutting off their escape routes. Tanks pushed through dense jungle terrain, flushing out resistance pockets. The final group was cornered in an abandoned mining facility. Their weapons nearly depleted, their food supplies gone, they made their last stand. It lasted 20 minutes. When the dust settled, the last of the Council's loyalists were nothing more than a memory. The future of the Dominion. With the final battle won, Elias Carter stood in the Dominion's new War Council chamber, staring at a holographic projection of the galaxy. "It's done," Vasquez said, stepping beside him. "There's no one left to fight." Carter exhaled slowly. "Then we start the real work." For the first time in history, the galaxy was united, not under the false banner of peace, but under the reality of true strength. There were no more factions vying for control, no more corrupt leaders plotting in shadows. The Dominion had brought order, and order would remain. But this was only the beginning. The Dominion had no desire to rule with an iron fist. They were not tyrants. They were enforcers of balance. As part of their new governance, planetary governments were allowed limited autonomy, so long as they adhered to Dominion law. Trade flourished under strict oversight, ensuring that corruption never took root again. There were those who feared this new rule, but fear was necessary. Carter turned to his officers, his voice calm but resolute. "We do not rule. We protect. We do not oppress. We enforce. We do not negotiate with chaos. We eliminate it." The final warning. Though the war was over, Carter knew peace was an illusion. Deep in the unexplored regions of space, there were whispers of a new force rising, something different, something unknown. The galaxy, for all its newfound order, would never be free of threats. But this time the Deathworlders would be ready. The last message sent from Terra's reach to all surviving independent systems was simple. "You saw what happened when our patience ran out. Test us again, and you will see what happens when we have none left."